Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura, and this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking.
Irish author Claire Keegan is generally considered to be one of the finest writers working today. Every word is the right word in the right place, and the effect is resonant and deeply moving, said Hilary Mantel of her work. Well, the Colm Toiíbín Claire Keegan makes her moments real, and then she makes them matter. Praise indeed, but what did our brand new podcast book club make of So Late in the Day, her most recently published short story? We'll be reporting back.
We're also rounding up a few standouts from our recent reading piles, from J.L. Carr's meditative classic, A Month in the Country, to V.E. Schwab's latest fantasy novel, The Fragile Threads of Power.
All that coming up here on the Book Club Review. Listeners, a quick aside before we get started, let me just tell you about our new Patreon account. Whether you're a long-time listener or if you've just discovered the pod, this is where you can support what we do. We want to keep the podcast ad-free because we don't want to listen to ads any more than you do, but it does cost us two things to make the show: money and time. Over the years, many of you have told us how much you enjoy the podcast. So for the first time, we're offering you a way that you can support us. And in return, you'll get weekly book recommendations from me, and at the higher tier, patrons get occasional extra episodes and membership of our monthly Zoom book club, currently reading Monsters by Claire Keegan. All the info is at the link in the show notes. We'd love for you to take a look. But for now, on with the episode.
You have thunderstorms, I have rain. It's nice. So Kate, some of our listeners may know, but not all our listeners may know, that you, and I do credit you, have recently launched our Patreon account. And if people become members, one of the things that they can experience is a book club. The first one was with you, but I may be a special guest here and there. Was it just last night that you had the first book club?
It was Sunday night, and yeah, I had been very nervous, not knowing if anyone would be free, because I knew that people had signed up and I knew that people potentially could come, but I didn't have a formal... Oh,
I heard that.
that's a thunderstorm.
What was that going on? That was her foreboding feelings ahead of time.
Apocalyptic crack of thunder. Yeah, I didn't know if anyone was going to come. And then, yeah, I set up the Zoom and I reminded them all. And then I logged on and there were a few people in the waiting room. And then I let these people in. And it was so lovely because these are people who I'm used to seeing, like these teeny tiny little icons on Instagram. And the name, that's all I know about them really. And there they were in the flesh, these people that I felt like I knew because I interacted with them. Anyway, it was just lovely. It was so lovely. And we talked about, I think another key to my success with this first one was that we talked about this very short book by Claire Keegan, which is a single story, So Late in the Day, which is a mere, what is it? For that one person who loves to know the page counts of things, 47 pages long.
Ooh, that's easy. You could read that and then come to book club. Be a 2-hour jaunt.
So we've both read Claire Keegan before, haven't we? She was shortlisted for the Booker and we read and talked about So Late in the Day. And that is a short story. Would you call it a short story or a novella? Did we call it a novella?
I called it a novella.
Yeah.
I think it's about 110 pages.
So a novella that did incredibly well. It was shortlisted for the Booker, but it felt like it had such a resonance and it was the book. I think also because it was quite short, lots and lots and lots of people read it and engaged with it. And I also think it was a very resonant subject. It dealt with the Magdalen laundries in Ireland where unmarried mothers were sent and then effectively became slaves in this system. And it was this awful, tragic thing that went on for a long, long time. And I think then what Claire Keegan was tapping into was the sense of a real reckoning with that past and an acknowledgement of what had gone on and a more public sense of almost sort of atonement needing to be made. And this wonderfully written, very simple story really tapped into that. But at the same time, I remember being slightly underwhelmed by it. I think perhaps because we read it for the Booker shortlist and I had that kind of really super critical mindset, I remember just thinking, oh, I don't really quite see what all the fuss is about. It wasn't that I didn't like it, I did, but do you know what I mean? I was just sort of a bit like, oh, this story, So Late in the Day, is the story where I think the penny has finally dropped and I now understand why Claire Keegan is so amazing. and what it is that people love so much about her work. It's very, very, very good. It tells the story of an Irishman, Cathal, and he is recounting his day. And then he goes home and he's sitting and he's watching TV and eating and drinking, but he's reflecting all the time. The story is his inner monologue. And what's so brilliant about it is the way it reveals itself as it goes along. And so you have this person initially who you're not unsympathetic towards, but there's these little hints all the time, just little words, little phrases that catch your attention and make you think that something's going on. And gradually, as the story goes on and on and on, and I don't want to spoil it by revealing what happens, but it so beautifully and neatly completes itself. And at the end, you have a completely different picture of this story, and you understand his perspective, and you have your own very clear perspective on what's happened. And then what you do then, Laura, is that you go back to the beginning and you read it again, which Claire Keegan hopes that people will do. She actually says that there's something about these very short things that she writes, but she kind of says she hopes people will read them more than once. And it's true that when you read it again, and you're not just reading it for plot, you really then see the magic of it. You just see all these little tiny touches. And it was just great. It was really great. I was so pleased that we did it.
It occurred to me that when you chose Claire Keegan for the first book club book, that given how critically acclaimed she is and how beloved, I think national treasure, international treasure, we don't say this anymore in our opener, but we used to always say, love it or loathe it. Was it a good book club book? Can anyone loathe the Claire Keegan story?
I mean,
is that possible?
I feel like I've come as close as you can by saying that I was underwhelmed by small things like these. That's probably the worst, that anyone's ever said about her. Yeah, no, it would be hard. It would be hard to loathe the Claire Keegan story. What did come up was that we were talking about other things that people had read, because I've only read small things like these, and now this one so late in the day. But a couple of the members had read Foster, which is, I think, the first short story of hers that was sort of properly published as a standalone. They said that's really lovely and slightly more upbeat in tone. There's actually a funny thing where it was published in America as a short story in the New Yorker. And so it's been out. It was out in America in the magazine, 2022. And it's only recently been published here in this beautiful standalone book format. But there are a few differences in the wording of the New Yorker article version and this printed version that we have here in the UK. And it's really interesting because she's someone who every word you feel has a weight to it. Not a heaviness, but just a kind of sense of having been so carefully considered. When you learn that things are different, it's just very, very interesting. And so we talked a little bit about some of those differences. And one other really nice thing is that the New Yorker Fiction podcast, it's a really good show to listen to, where they have a different writer on, and that writer chooses a story, and they usually read it and then they'll discuss it a little bit with Deborah Treisman, who's the host. And George Saunders picked this story by Claire Keegan, but he wasn't prepared to read it aloud. And that is because in the closing sequences of this book, the main character uses the C word. And George Saunders did not feel able to say that in a recording for posterity. And so what happened was that they got Claire Keegan to read the story herself. And then George and Deborah Treisman have a discussion about it. So if you haven't read So Late in the Day and you want to hear Claire Keegan read it to you, all you have to do is dial up that podcast in your podcast player, and you'll get to hear Claire Keegan read you the whole thing. And then you get to hear George Saunders telling you what he thinks of it, all of which is absolutely brilliant. Some of us had read it, some of us had listened to it, but I felt like all of us wanted to go and listen to it because it does feel like having her read it to you really adds something to it. But yeah, just generally, it was so lovely to finally realize that, yes, I see what it is. It's that sense of these words being so crafted. It's deceptively simple when you read them. And yet actually the complexity of what's going on underneath is so brilliant. And I feel like perhaps this is a story almost because apparently she wrote it as an exemplar. She wrote it because a student had asked her, she teaches writing, and a student had asked her how you write tension. And she wanted to write this story that would show that you could have tension without there being some big dramatic plot or jump scares or anything like that. It's all woven in. And so in this story, it's almost like the mechanism of how it's constructed is slightly on show. So then as a reader, you see that. And I love the way that that really had me appreciating her with new eyes. So yeah, a really interesting one, incredibly short read. You can read it in like 20 minutes and then you read it again. it was a great one to start off with, I think.
On the theme of short books, it's just a quick aside, but I went out to the Paper Hound in Vancouver, our favorite bookshop. I was looking for a sci-fi novel that I'll come to in a minute that I wanted to give to a friend because she was having a tough day and a tough week in the scheme of things, really tough. I couldn't find this page-turning sci-fi novel. What I did find was The English Understand Wool by Helen DeWitt.
Oh, love that.
Kate bought it for me from the Paper Hound when she was visiting in March. And I was like, oh, you know what? It's a beautiful edition. This friend loves beautifully designed things too. I'll get that for her. And I left it on her desk as a surprise with a note. And my note said, best read in one sitting with a cup of tea. Look after yourself this weekend. And then she came in the next week and she's like, oh my God, it was the perfect thing. And she and I don't always love the same book. So I was a little bit nervous. She's like, I thought it was so amazing. And she's like, you know, and because the protagonist is a 17-year-old girl, I gave it immediately to my 17-year-old daughter. She's like, now we can talk about it. Some listeners may not know what this is. It's a novella, a modern amorality drama about a 17-year-old girl, the wider shores of connoisseurship and the power of false friends. And that's all you need to know. But it is delicious. And I was so pleased that you having introduced it to me as a gift, I passed it on. Well, I bought a copy. She has her own. I definitely kept mine, but passed it on to another friend. Maybe she'll do the same.
Yeah, that's a book I read and immediately and almost involuntarily turned back to the beginning and then read it again. It's so wonderful.
Well, and you can. That's the thing about short novellas, right? I feel like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, if you told me I'll read a novella, I wouldn't have understood the point. Is it because we're older? I don't know what it is now. I'm like, oh, yes, please. I'd love to read a novella. And then, yes, as you say, I would reread it again.
I mean, you know, short stories are the time-poor reader's friend. You know what's even better than short stories? Poetry. I have recently started getting into poetry. I'm like, it's the way forward. You can read a poem in about 8 seconds.
Don't worry, listeners. She's not going to be allowed to come on and talk about poetry collections to us. I won't stand for it.
Just move aside the poetry collection that I have at my elbow here. But okay, come on.
I would just make it, but I was just going to say, I would make a distinction. I actually think short stories are too short. I think the novella is the way forward, like 70 to 80 pages. Because a short story you can read in 20 minutes. I think you want like a 60-minute reading experience.
That whole series, Storybook ND, I think is the name of the imprint, and they are specifically designed for that experience. I think there's a lovely little note where they say they want people to be able to recapture that feeling we had as young readers where we were able to just curl up and read a whole book in an afternoon. And I think that with that one, they really nailed it. The trouble is, that one was so good. I have kind of looked at other books in the Storybook ND series. I'm like, will it be? I'm not sure. I basically haven't tried another one.
Forthcoming, Natalia Ginsberg, The Road to the City. That's the Italian writer who wrote Family Lexicon. And she is great.
I've never read her, so that would be a really good one for me.
Well, there you go. That could be one to pick out. But yes, you were going to ask me about my other reading?
Yeah, we haven't caught up for a while. So what else have you been reading?
So many things. I've got about 8 stacks of different books around me. I'll rocket through the things I don't really want to talk about. I started Tom Lake, Anne Patchett's latest novel.
Oh, yeah.
I got about halfway through and was like, this is getting gloomy. I don't feel like reading gloomy fiction related to climate change, not least when it was the middle of summer and forest fires were raging. Maybe I'll never go back to it. Who could say? But I was reminded of what a great storyteller Anne Patchett is, touching Tom Lake, but also because my Vancouver book club read Bel Canto, which I read 10, 15 years ago, maybe longer. She's a really strong storyteller, like great characters, very well developed, not necessarily a lot happens. Still think The Dutch House is probably my favorite by her. On to my comfort reading, before I get to the good stuff, I slipped in Georgette Heyer's The Masqueraders. And then this is kind of embarrassing. Well, maybe not embarrassing, however, enlightening. I got a Julia Quinn novel, who is the author behind the Bridgerton series. This is from the bookshelves in my local grocery store that we have discussed in the past.
Yes.
I took this to Whistler for the night because I was heading up there with my husband just for a quick break. And I was like, oh, I'll just take it. I picked up The Secrets of Sir Richard Kenworthy. Can I just tell you, one, there was a lot of sex, which I should have known.
Yeah, I would be utterly unsurprised by that.
But two, it was the most anyway, Kate, we have been called out for being snotty in the past, but I was quite surprised by
just how bad it was.
Just how bad it was. Just truly how
Well,
terrible.
that reassures me, because I actually thought for a minute that you were going to tell me it was really great and I was going to have to revise everything I thought about.
It was dire. Even the plot was like, you could see the secret a mile off from the very beginning. So that's the reading from this summer that doesn't really warrant too much of discussion. But I want to show you this, which Kim at the Paper Hound pointed out to me. You can't see it. Listeners, you can't see it. Kate can't see it either. It is a Dell 50-cent edition with the green pages, printed in the early 1950s. And it's Josephine Tey's Miss Pym Disposes. Murder, Jealousy, and Hate. An unusually good story. Josephine Tey writes with wit and humor, adding just enough suspense to tease the reader into believing that dire things are going to happen. And they do too. Listeners, we have a mutual friend named Frances, who's magazine editor and huge reader. And she has a real passion, I'd say, for books written by women between 1920 and 1960 or so. And I messaged her right away after Kim suggested I pick this one up and was like, have you read this? She's like, oh yes, I read that last year. It's a murder mystery set in a calisthenics/gymnastics college in 1947. And Miss Pym is a psychology writer who goes to visit an old friend who's the head teacher there. And then she stays through the exam period. A lot of nothing happens, but it's so well written in sort of crisp, cool, sardonic writing. It was a delight.
Oh.
I was so pleased.
I have never heard of it. That sounds brilliant.
I'll come on to my other books in a minute, but what about you? What have you been reading?
Well,
I was rocketing through.
Yeah, I feel like I've had a good reading summer. Even though I've been quite busy, I do feel like I'm managing to fit in the reading, mainly because I've read quite a few things that are quite short. I wanted to talk about, I had this really amazing experience at the beginning of last week. I'd been feeling a bit frazzled. I've been having a really stressful time at work. Normally, I have this day off. And normally on the day off, I go and do exercise and I get a lot of stuff done. And I had this real no, I'm just going to not do any of those things. And I'm not going to go home, because if I do, I'll just have to tidy the house and do all these chores. I'm going to go to the park and I'm going to read A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr, which had been recommended to me by my friend Sean. It's one of his favourite books of all time. It's a book that he rereads the most. And I had never read it. It's not long. It's 127 pages or so, I think. I don't have it on me. I don't know what's happened to it. I have put it somewhere and I keep waiting for it to turn up. And so far it hasn't. So I can't quote from it or do anything helpful.
I need to just let listeners know that I'm looking at you over Skype. And behind Kate, there are boxes and boxes of books.
Yeah, but none of them is A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr.
Of the boxes. And also books stacked on top of the bench that I can see on the other side of her.
I don't know what. Anyway, it's vanished.
You need some more bookshelves.
It will turn up when it wants to be found. It's a story about a World War I veteran who is traumatized by his experiences. He survived, but he has a facial twitch and he can't sleep. He has these horrible dreams that just keep him awake. He feels like he's back there. And we meet him on the train and he's going to this small village in Yorkshire. And we learn that he is going to be restoring a mural that's been painted over in an old church there, a medieval church. So then we follow him to this village and he meets the person he's working for, the vicar, and he gets working on this mural and gradually we start to get to know him a bit better. He's very self-contained and really expecting to go and do this work and be isolated, I suppose. But what happens is that people start to come and visit him. People are interested in what he's doing and he starts to have these conversations. And there's also someone else there who's also an ex-soldier he's sort of prospecting for, I think he's an archaeologist and he's been charged with trying to find the bones of this person who disappeared under some kind of scandalous circumstances sort of 100 years before. So they connect up. And then it's quite descriptive about the village and the countryside, and you get these little bits of detail about the lives of the people there. But nothing much really happens. It's not really a book about things happening. It's just very simple. And then at the end, this time has passed and his work is completed and he leaves. And he leaves all these threads, I suppose, behind him. You know, relationships that perhaps could have travelled further, but he chose not to pursue them. Or the way that people felt about him, but he is now leaving. And so that connection has been lost. And at the end, later on in his life, he's reflecting back on this period of time and what he experienced there. And what you realise is that that time healed him. He was significantly better at the end of that time than he had been at the beginning. Time and this place and the community had worked a certain magic, I suppose. But what's wonderful about it and what you really take away from it is that it's a book about experience and it's about time and it's about the way that we go through periods in our lives where we experience certain things and we don't really even think that much of them when they're happening. We're just in them. And then later on, when we look back on them, we perhaps start to understand the preciousness of that experience that we have. But also with that, this understanding that you could never go back, you could never repeat it. And if you did go back, and even if you did exactly the same things, it would never be the same. So there was something really profound in there, I suppose, about living and about the way that our experiences shape us and make us who we are and the things that we carry with us throughout our lives. It was just wonderful. And it's not long. And I got to sit there in this sunny park that's a very special place for me. It's a beautiful park, but it's also a place where I spent so much time with my children, and still, even now, I still there quite a lot with my kids. So I was in a place that's very special to me, but also very conscious that that time, they're no longer little, my children. We've really moved on from that time. And I would recommend it to anyone and everyone I've mentioned to, because I think a lot of people have read it. Immediately they're like, oh, Month in the Country, it's so great. It's just wonderful and really life enhancing. And the only other thing I'd say is that I took this time and I spent probably 2 hours maybe sitting there reading it. And then I went back into this very busy work and sort of slightly stressful and lots going on and busy at home as well. And yet I had such a sense of calm and this almost like slight light I was carrying within me that sustained me through that in this really tangible way. I kind of had this real moment of like, wow, hey, reading, taking time out, so good for you. We should all try and do it more. So yeah, that was really special. And I wanted to pass that one on.
That sounds great. And I'm surprised both that I've never heard of it and in a way that you've never read it, because it sounds like a real classic.
I had seen the film, I feel like maybe a long, long time ago, but I'd never read it. So yeah, I recommend it. I'll bet Kim has a copy.
I bet you she does. Speaking of Kim, I popped in the other day and was looking for my latest book club book, which she didn't have. But I picked up a copy of The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim.
Oh, that's great.
You've read that,
yeah.
Right? And did you talk at length about Elizabeth's garden?
I loved Elizabeth and her German garden, which is about her terrible relationship she has with this man that she's married to, but this extraordinary house she lives in and the garden she makes there. And yeah, it was really good.
Well, The Enchanted April is for women of different ages who have retreated to a castle near Portofino. And Mrs. Wilkins, who I'm already very much in love with, she's just very, very endearing, and she's in a very unhappy relationship with a overbearing solicitor in Hampstead. And there's lots of hilarious digs at Hampstead, because I think Lady Caroline is like, they must not have much money because they live in Hampstead. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, how times have changed. But it is a discrete period of time. They're there for a month, and what will happen to them, I don't yet know. There's lots of long, slow sentences about the scenery and some great interpersonal drama between them, like very low stakes, low grade tension. I'm enjoying that very much. I know exactly what you mean about how sometimes books can be a refuge from the day-to-day. And I always remember this being young, but when you're reading a really good book, it can create a safe, tranquil space you want to return to. Or it can almost be like you're living in a parallel reality because the events and the drama and the characters in that book with you are alive. And you know that feeling where you're like, well, great, I'm done my day. I need to go read my book now because what have they been doing all day? I need to go catch up with them. Well, I was so lucky because I had that experience now. I've had it with 2 of the books in a trilogy by a sci-fi author named Anne Leckie. I saw her recommended at the Elliott Bay Bookshop, one of Kate's new favorite places in the world and my favorite bookshop in the world, down in Seattle. I trust their recommendations for fantasy and sci-fi authors implicitly. They always seem to get it right. And I always think for people who don't rate fantasy or sci-fi, to each their own. But also, there's a lot of garbage and it can be hard to find the good stuff. So they recommended Anne Leckie, and I finally found her up here in the library and picked up this first book in a series called Ancillary Justice. And I love it so much, Kate, and you should read it. Ancillary Justice is about an AI who was once the AI in a massive battleship up in space. And the culture that she's in uses she implicitly. So it's actually it's not confusing. It's just that gender is sort of irrelevant and just only comes up when they encounter other civilizations because they're constantly muddling whether or not it's a she or a he. Because in their culture, people have different sex, but they're all she's. Anyway, that's an aside. She was once a huge spaceship. And in this world, the people she serves, they take over other civilizations, other planets. And for a good chunk of the local population, they turn them basically into ancillaries, which are kind of just like not zombies, but vehicles for the AI to be plugged in. So she's a spaceship, but she's also, as an AI, plugged into 50 human bodies, which is quite fun in terms of narrative point of view, because she's everywhere all the time from different perspectives. But that's in the past. And when we meet her, she's alone. She's lost her ship. She's the same AI, but only has one body. And she's in a cold and distant land, and she's on a mission for revenge, but we don't know why. And then it progresses from there. Really great world building, really great storytelling. And I just love the characters. You would think an AI might not be. Certainly the characters around her don't think that an AI can be like a human. But actually she has a huge amount of heart. She's been alive for 3,000 years. It did get me to mulling. I was like, goodness me, I feel like I'm much wiser now at 38 than I was at 28. Can you imagine how wise we'd be, Kate, if we lived to be 3,000?
But it doesn't.
Wiser, childish.
Was it written before, the current, it's happened so recently, hasn't it? But now AI is a real thing. And also not only that, but a thing that everyone is quite worried about. Were these books written pre that?
Yes, but not by much. There's a lot of that in there. The AI is essentially benevolent and there to serve. But there's also this sense that the AI is cold and clinical and can't love. And that proves not to be the case. And actually, the AIs can be maybe not as human as we are, but just as intricate in their personalities and psychologies. And then there's this great rip-roaring plot of how she's going to get revenge, but we don't know what's happened in the past, what happened to her ship, why is she all alone now? And it's smart enough in terms of the world building and the language and the cultural differences that you feel rewarded by it. Maybe not challenged, but rewarded. It's not quite as challenging as Le Guin. She's good, but she's not quite as cerebral as Le Guin. So that makes it easier to move from one book to the next because you don't need to have a year palate cleanser before you can go back and really stimulate your brain in the same way again.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. It's been a long time since I've read a good sci-fi novel.
I know, and I don't actually read that much sci-fi generally, but I think maybe I've been missing out a bit.
Well, there is absolutely no point of comparison between that and the book I wanted to flag up, which I read over the summer, and I just didn't want to miss out from talking about it on the podcast because it's so, so good. By another Irish author. This time it's Claire Kilroy. It's called Soldier Sailor, and it is a novel about a woman who is in the early days of motherhood.
Fun days.
Yeah, I mean, also, I feel like there's a lot of this sort of stuff about. There's many a book now which is sort of peeling back the curtain on the early days of motherhood and how awful it all is. Or not awful, it's not awful, but it's just unexpectedly difficult. Like, you think it's going to be hard, but you have no idea how hard. I think that was my take on it. And so everyone is a bit aggrieved because, there's a strong part of you who's like, no one told me about this. Anyway, now we have these books. People writing these books that are really telling the story. But what I loved about this is that this felt to me like a very fresh take that I absolutely loved. It's kind of hard to describe, so I did just want to read a little bit, which I plucked at random. I could have read any of it to give you a sense. But this is a little passage I thought was quite revealing. It begins, it's the narrator talking. I opened my eyes. You can sleep standing up. Another lesson learned the hard way. I'd been back in that dream, that hideous dream I used to get about you, when your father asked whether I was going to it. To what? I responded in mild alarm. What had I forgotten this time? And why had I come to the fridge? You were on my hip. You were always on my hip. My body had twisted to adapt to your weight like those wind-blown trees that grow by cliffs. My belly button still isn't central. To that. He tapped the flyer held to the fridge door by a magnet. The primary colours of the baby and toddler group. Toy blocks, handprints, ABCs. Images that are patronising now that I think about it, given the target audience is not the infant, but the adult who brings the infant along, the invariably female adult. I thought you said you were bringing him to that. What day is it? Thursday. Oh, every Thursday morning, said the flyer. The bins have to go out. You should bring him to that, concluded the child development specialist. Socialise him, he added, a word he had picked up from me. I had been talking about socialising you at the baby and toddler group for weeks, although now apparently it was his idea. Problem was I couldn't get out of the house on time. It was difficult to explain the obstacles to my husband because they weren't obstacles he recognised. They weren't obstacles I'd recognised before having you, the whole 3 steps forwards, 2 steps back racket. Since becoming mobile, you could undo faster than I could do. It wasn't yet fully bright outside. My husband was already dressed, his hair damp from the shower. I was still in my pyjamas. I opened the fridge and stared at the contents, hoping for a clue. They were sockets, my eyes, 2 hot holes bored into my skull. I feel more tired than when I went to bed. Bad night? Silly question. All the nights were bad.
Her husband asked her if it was a bad night.
Your father still slept in the box room. I just don't feel able for today. I need to get some work done. Maybe when you're home you can do his bedtime? I'm working late again. Yes, the office. His suit, his tie, my pyjamas, my postpartum body, a roll of flab for my roll of flab. Engage the core, the app exhorted me. What did that even mean? Still no idea why I'd come to the fridge. I swung the door shut again. Milk, my husband reminded me. I pulled the door open and handed him the milk. Jesus Christ, is that all there is left? Sorry. Milk was my responsibility.
Well, her husband sounds dire.
It is her story as she's relating it to the child. The child is the sailor. And you get her monologue and you get this sense of the husband. And yes, I mean, he is the worst. He is beyond anything. You're just furious. You're absolutely furious because he's so hopeless. And she's having to deal with everything. But gradually, as the book goes on, it's much more subtle than that because you start to see that, sure, he's just useless. But at the same time, her perspective is not balanced. She is hypersensitive to the inequalities between their situations, which is one that society imposes. It is not one of his making or her making. So it's tapping into the wider structural issues around the distribution of labour between men and women when it comes to rearing children. It is absolutely wonderful. She's so lonely, finding it all so hard. And in the playground, finally, she makes a friend. She meets another dad who has 3 young children of his own. He's often there at the same time that she is, and they connect. And finally, she has someone she can laugh at it all with a little bit and see the funny side. And also he helps her with practical things. You know, he gives her tips and she follows them and finds that things get a bit better. And you think then that this relationship is perhaps going to be a problem, but also an escape. But it's not that, you know, and I love that about it. It really dances around this novel and it keeps you on your toes. It was absolutely wonderful. And you know what? I will be astonished if any book I read that is on the Booker shortlist is better than this. I thought it was really a surprise that this was not even longlisted. I thought it was absolutely amazing. I would love you to read it. I think you would really enjoy it. Really, really great.
I think I could read it now. You know, my daughter is almost 4 in 2 weeks, so it feels long enough ago. I always look back at that period and I don't think anyone actually told this to me. I think it was something I came to the conclusion maybe around 8 months. My top advice for anyone who's having a baby, which is like, you didn't decide to have a baby. You decided to have a child. You just have to get through having a baby.
Yes.
And they will not always be a baby.
That's so good.
And then it will be fun. But having a baby is not fun.
No.
I mean, and if you're surrounded by family and support and your husband doesn't have to work long hours, or maybe he's doing full-time care, because, you know, not that mine could do that, but I know fathers who do. Maybe it would be different, but still, just remember, they will become a delightful child who will then also keep you up in the night in different ways. But they'll give back. They won't be mewling.
And they grow. And as my sister-in-law, who's got much older children than me, said, they turn into the most delightful human beings who are people you want to spend time with more than anyone else. So, you know, you sort of have all that to look forward to. You just have to get through when they're, perhaps not so much when they're babies, but when they're toddlers. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, anyway, I just loved it. I would urge all of you to seek it out. It's a really wonderful book.
I have one book to finish with. This is a book that kept me occupied when I was avoiding reading the second half of Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry.
Oh.
Now, listeners, you know that Kate loved Lonesome Dove.
Well, we're not talking about Lonesome Dove.
It would be a great book club book. We're not. We're not talking about that.
Because we're saving it, right, for our special episode to come.
Yes.
Yeah.
Special episode with Phil from my book club. We're going to talk about Lonesome Dove next. While I was avoiding Lonesome Dove on my summer holiday, I was reading a Phil recommendation, which is Burnham Wood by Eleanor Catton, who is the author of the Booker Prize winning The Luminaries, also an excellent BBC series, which I enjoyed very much. So I was quite excited about Burnham Wood. Phil told me that he blitzed through it in like 48 hours, and it is in fact 420 pages. So for Phil, it doesn't surprise me. I think I was more like 72. It is set in New Zealand. There's a cast of characters, but at its heart are these 2 young women. And as it says on the flaps, they have a unregulated, sometimes criminal, sometimes philanthropic guerrilla gardening collective that plants crops wherever no one will notice. So the founder is Mira, and her very best friend is Shelley, and the two of them head up this collective, which is very left-wing, very progressive, very grassroots. And Mira's been looking around for something that can maybe help them cut through to the next level, to get some funding, to become a properly funded nonprofit. And she's very much driven by the fact that Shelley seems to be on the way out. Shelley's pulling back. Shelley's not engaging anymore. She thinks Shelley's going to quit. So when Mira finds this land, well, hears about this land, it's in the interior of New Zealand somewhere, I say with authority, there's been a rock slide. And the rock slide has cut off the main route into this town and the surrounding farmlands. And there's only another small road that takes the long way in. So essentially people have emptied out of this town. And in fact, there's a sheep farmer who's just left the farm and isn't there anymore. And Mira reads about it. So she decides she's going to go down with the collective and check it out. Now, the other major character in this novel is basically Elon Musk, although his name is not Elon Musk. He is an American billionaire, Robert Lemoyne, and he's made a lot of his money in drones and other activities. And he has put about the story to anyone who would be paying attention that he has bought some land to turn into a bunker. I say he's put about the story. That's his cover story. He's actually doing something far more nefarious, which I won't get into. And so there's this crossing of these two different groups, this honestly hilariously pure evil American billionaire and these quite self-righteous, indignant, and a little bit annoying left-wing activists coming together in the New Zealand wilderness with dire consequences. It's quite something. Phil was like, I loved it. I was like, it's ludicrous.
And not too much cli-fi existential dread.
It's less about climate crisis and more about, not that this should be less depressing, but the pillaging of nature, the ruination of nature. It's very melodramatic. This billionaire is really evil. These left-wing activists talk a lot to each other about capitalism and other such things in a way where you're like, well, you know, yeah, but also, you know, I'm not 22. And even then, I think I was a bit, not that I'm not left-wing, listeners. I am quite left-wing, but perhaps I'm not as left-wing as a New Zealand activist.
I'm not quite sure. So is this a recommend or is this I thought it was a bit ridiculous. You know?
Oh, I think it's ridiculous.
But did you like it?
No, but it's easy to read. I think it would be a great book club book. I still haven't discussed it with Phil properly. The reason why I found it problematic is towards the end, it just gets loopy. And I didn't find the motivations of this billionaire in any way convincing. And I didn't find the level of conspiracy you had to believe in plausible. And almost certainly that's me. Other listeners might be the same, others might not. So it's a funny one. I actually think I would recommend it to people who are intrigued. I enjoyed it in the sense that I got through it really quickly, thought it was a bit silly, and really want to discuss it with Phil at some point.
It sounds like one maybe to earmark for the pod book club. Might be a good one. So much depends, does it not, I think, on how an author wraps something up. And they're not always good at it. But someone who is very, very, very good at endings is V.E. Schwab, Victoria Schwab. Do you like how I worked?
She's very excited.
It's the thing I really want to talk about. So pod listeners, long time, will have heard me before talk about how much I loved V.E. Schwab's Darker Shades of Magic books, which is a trilogy, which I just loved so much. I have read them more than 3 times. I've read them so often. They really speak to something in me which takes me back to the fantasy novels that I loved when I was a teenager, I think. I read them with that almost slightly childlike enthusiasm, and I love the books in themselves, but I feel like perhaps what's going on is that they're tapping back into that for me, which I just adored. To very briefly recap, they're set in London, but it's alternate London. It's magic London back in sort of 18th century. The main character is a magician called Kell, who is very unusual in that he is able to command magic to the degree that he can actually traverse through into different worlds. And there are these other versions of London. There's Grey London, which is actually our London in the time of King George III. And then there is White London, where everyone's a bit, well, depressed and deranged is how I describe the White Londoners, because life is hard there, which has not very much magic. So our London, Grey London, has no magic. White London has very little. And then there's Black London, which is so powerful and so dangerous that it's actually been sealed off from the other London's, because of the existential threat that it poses. But Kell is able to travel between these worlds, and in Grey London, he meets Lila, who is a thief, a pickpocket. She's a young woman who doesn't have much in the world, but is very resourceful and manages to get by. And she steals something from Kell, and this artifact that she takes kickstarts then a whole chain of consequences that then take you through that book and the 2 books that follow in the trilogy. Each one is beautifully structured. I feel like you could read any one of them as a standalone, but together they make a really comprehensive, very engaging story arc. And the ending is fantastic. I loved the way she wrapped it up. I felt like I was fully satisfied that the story had been resolved, but at the same time it was very open, and a sense that these characters were going to go on and you could just travel on with them in your imagination, which is just what I always want from a book. I always want them to end like that. And they so rarely do. And then I saw on her Instagram that she was going back there. She was going to write another book. And I had these really mixed feelings about it because I felt so strongly about these 3 books. I was like, oh, what if it's not as good, this new one? What if it spoils the way I feel about the original books? Do I dare read it? Nonetheless, I was enthusiastic enough about the idea that I pre-ordered it on the Kindle. And then suddenly last weekend, I happened to open it up and there it was. It was sitting right there waiting for me. And I've had this crazy week, no time to read it all. But of course, inevitably, I did start reading it. And I immediately was just so happy to be back in this world, back with these characters. But also there are some new characters that are brilliant and engaging, and you very quickly become very invested in them. And the original characters are that bit older now. Time has passed. It's 7 or 8 years on from the events of the last book in the trilogy. And they're different now from how they were when they were younger. And I thought that was handled really beautifully. And there's a lovely interplay then between the new storyline that's going on and picking up the threads of the old story that you know very well, which I thought was done really well. And then it has everything. It has sea voyages, it has adventures, it has uncharted lands, it has a power struggle, there's a political thing going on, there's chase sequences, there's a masquerade, there's love. I mean, I don't know, what more do people want? I ask you. It was all in there and it was really well done. All I would say to anyone who did love the Darker Shades books is do not be afraid to read this. You are in very, very safe hands. V.E. Schwab is a brilliant writer, I think. And she puts a lot of heart into these books. Not only her skill as a writer, but you can tell her love and care. And you sense that she loves Red London and these characters as much as you do. And she's also very happy to be back there. So it was a treat. It's been one of those books. Like you were saying, actually, this is the book where every spare moment I've had, I've got it out. And I've so happily dived back in and so narrowly avoided missing my stop on the tube so many times because I would suddenly glance up and be like, oh my God, have to run off because I've been busy reading some part of the adventure. They're great. It's great. The Fragile Threads of Power, it's called, by V.E. Schwab.
I don't know what I'm holding out for. I will dabble in V.E. Schwab at some point. I do promise that.
I recommended these before and I felt like you looked at them and just felt like, they're not for you. And we talked, hadn't we, about the trouble is with fantasy, particularly it seems like it's quite a personal thing. And this, just really pushed my buttons in a good way.
And as you said, it's often what fantasy you read as a teenager.
Absolutely.
That affects what you want to keep reading.
Long-time listeners.
How does she rate?
You know me, you know the kinds of things I like. If you like those things too, then I urge you to give this a try.
I think that's it. I'm on the fence. I can't decide. You and I like lots of the same things. But V.E. Schwab, I'm like, I don't know if that's one that we'll share. And maybe I don't want to take it away from you. I can remain neutral if I haven't dabbled.
That's true. Gosh, I wonder how I would feel as well about, I'm not sure I would want to know what someone else thought of them. So again, listeners, by all means, go and read them. Don't talk to me about them.
If you don't like them.
Especially if you don't like them. I don't want to hear that.
Oh, well, this has been so good. I'm glad we're over the summer months. And I know I haven't been around very much, listeners, but we're going to be back soon to talk about Lonesome Dove.
Well, before you disappear, just tell us what you're reading now or next.
Well, I told you I'm reading The Enchanted April.
Oh, is that your... Right.
By Elizabeth von Arman. And then I'm going to read Our Wives Under the Sea, which is one you enjoyed so very much.
Oh,
and
Julia
which I got my UK book club to read. Yeah, so we'll be discussing that in a few weeks.
That is a great read. I just saw a picture on someone's Instagram the other day of the UK edition of the paperback, which has the most beautiful spreads I think I've ever seen. They're like an exquisite marble, but it almost looks like an oil slick. It's amazing. I would get it just for those alone. I am going to read the new Lauren Groff, The Vaster Wilds, which I just spotted in bookshop. I was in Book Bar the other day and it was right there on the shelf. I got the last copy, signed by the Groff herself. So this is, people will know, the author of Matrix, which we read and absolutely loved, didn't we, on the pod? It was such a good book club book.
You absolutely
Did you not? Were you not there? I can't remember, yeah.
I liked it, but you loved it.
Well, interestingly,
you and Phil loved it.
Lucy at Book Bar who was not a fan of Matrix, has been really loving this latest one, which is, it's again set in the medieval period. When was the medieval period? But, 1600s. It's a young girl who's escaping from some settlement where you get the impression that she has not been particularly well used, and she's fleeing because there is famine, there's no food, and I think it's a case of if she stayed, she knew she would die, and so she's escaping. And so the first chapter is just about her running through the woods, and you're right there with her, and you feel like, oh my God, she knows she's going to be pursued, and then snow starts to fall and cover her tracks, and so you have a sense that she is going to escape. But yeah, I just felt straight away so happy to be reading Lauren Groff again. I think I'm going to love it. We'll see. I will report back. But yeah, that's my next read.
I will definitely read that one too, so we can confer.
And then we've got to get to those Booker books. It's hard, isn't it, to knuckle down, particularly to that shortlist. Anyway, we will.
No, those are my non-committal noises, listeners.
Yes.
We'll see.
We'll see how that goes.
I'm having such a good time reading books of my own choice right now.
That's the trouble. I mean, that's what Chrissy and I were saying. It's like, we know we want to read the Booker list, and these are the books that this panel of judges has designated the most interesting, worthwhile novels that they felt have come out this year, and so we must then pay attention to that. But it's really hard when, there's a new Lauren Groff novel to be read.
And it's not on the list, so I mean, come on, guys.
Yeah.
Like, help us out here.
Anyway, we will get to it, and I can't wait. That's nearly it for this episode. Books mentioned were So Late in the Day and Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, The English Understand Wool by Helen DeWitt, The Road to the City by Natalia Ginsberg, Tom Lake, Bel Canto and the Dutch House by Anne Patchett, The Masqueraders by Georgette Heyer, The Secrets of Sir Richard Kenworthy by Julia Quinn, Miss Pym Disposes by Josephine Tay, A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr, Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy, Burnham Wood by Eleanor Catton, and The Fragile Threads of Power by V.E. Schwab. This episode of the Book Club Review was edited and produced by me, Kate Slotover, here in London. Whenever you listen to this episode, if you have thoughts on it, Laura and I would love to hear them. Comment anytime on the episode page, on our website, thebookclubreview.co.uk, linked in the show notes, which is also the place to go for an episode transcript. Comments there go straight to our inboxes, so drop us a line. We always love to hear from you. As I mentioned at the beginning, you'll find the link to where you can get all the information about our Patreon account and how you can support us there in the show notes. For book reviews and updates between episodes, do follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on X at Book Club RVW Pod, or drop us a line anytime at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And one free way to support us is to take a moment to rate and review the show on your podcast platform of choice, which really helps other listeners find it. And if you enjoy it, tell your friends. But for now, thanks for listening and happy book clubbing.